Welcome to the Help We Need podcast, where we explore topics that empower women and support their well-being. I'm your host, Fumike Murunkeji, and today we'll be talking about caregiving for the elderly, a topic that deeply touches our hearts. I dare say as well that today's episode goes beyond our women community who often bear the burden of caring for the elderly. So whether you're a daughter, son, or friend, this episode is for you. So grab your favorite cup of tea, a bottle of water, or look for a cozy spot, or just stay tuned in from wherever you are, and let us explore together the wisdom and love that caring for our elders brings to our lives. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Miss Susan Hackburn, who works as a chaplain in a charity organization in the UK called Methodist Home for the Aged, MHA. This home was founded by Methodist clergy over 80 years ago. Miss Susan has worked with this organization in two of their schemes for over 8 years. The first scheme is a care home that takes care of the elderly living with dementia, and the second scheme is a retirement living home for the elderly. Prior to this as well, Miss Susan also worked in the home care environment as a carer, taking care of the elderly for about 4 years. Hello, Miss Susan. It's so good to have you join us on our episode for today to talk about elderly care. We're so delighted to have you with us.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me as well.
Of course. For the purpose of today's discussion, before we kick off, I would first like to mention to our listeners that according to the World Health Organization, WHO, the elderly are referred to as people aged 60 to 75 years old and above. However, the aging process is not uniform across populations due to differences in genetics, lifestyle, and overall health. Also, in most developed Western countries, the retirement age is set at the age of 65 years. However, WHO categorizes chronological old age into three categories, namely young age, that is, the ages between 65 to 75 years old, a transition period between working life and retirement. Also, advanced old age, that is, the ages between 75 to 85 years old, when functional losses may begin to occur in the elderly. And lastly, very advanced old age, that is 85 years and older. So as we use the word elderly in our discourse for today, please note that we're referring to seniors ranging from young to advanced to very advanced old age. So Miss Susan, I would like to start off our questions for today on your view about the myths that surround elderly care, especially as it relates to placing the elderly in a residential aged care facility, often referred to as care home or nursing home or any other such schemes for the elderly, which some parts of the world people also refer to as old people's home.
Thank you so very much, Fumike. It's a big world out there, I tell you, working with the elderly, because we pray for long life, and but somehow we never seem to associate, the peculiarities of aging. And because of this, you find out that in some societies of the world, there are so many myths surrounding sending a loved one to a care home to be taken care of. And some of the myths are held by the society at large about putting their loved ones in a care home. And also the other group of myths are held by the elderly themselves. I'd like to start with the myths held by the society at large with regards to putting a loved one in a care home in those parts of the world where we still have myths. But because like here in the Western world, it's a norm. It's accepted by people in the society that is a correct thing to do. But in other societies, there's usually a question mark. And some of the myths, for instance, are that it is an inhumane thing to do to put your loved one in a care home. And it's not. It's not because society now is a fast-paced society. Back about, call it about 50 years ago, let's use where we grew up. For instance, in Africa, you know, men would marry a couple of wives to help, you know, cultivate the farm because farming was a major means of livelihood. And that was all. You know, they would work with a husband in the farm, they would raise children. So the woman's life was principally, you know, centered around the home. And whatever money they had was enough to see them through. But over the years, as you are very much aware, society has moved on. One, the world population has more than doubled. They have so many mouths to feed. And there's so much competition for jobs. So therefore, in a home now, of course, except of course such a person is a millionaire, the head of the home is a millionaire or so, you know, women now work to support their husband, to support the family. So if they have an aged parent, it's a normal thing, it's natural to put them in a care home. It's not inhumane because staff in the care home are properly trained. For instance, here in the Western world, working in a care home, you have, number one, the government watching. You also have the police watching. You understand? So you can't afford to be wicked or to do anything that you're not expected to do to the elderly. They are classified as vulnerable. And here in the Western world, the government takes priority looking after those classified as vulnerable, the elderly, those living with some form of disability, and so on. They don't joke. They monitor the care that is given to them. And so staff that work in that sector are very much well trained, and not just trained for the job. We are given refresher courses every single year if you have to remain in that industry for whatever role you have been employed to serve in. Then we also have the a notion, the myth that relatives who take their loved ones into a care home facility, they tend to abandon them or turn their back away from them. That's not correct. It's not correct at all. Because like I had mentioned in the first case, you know, the loved ones, their child, they are busy, you know, working to maintain a home. I mean, imagine a scenario where there's a husband, there's a wife, and then they have children, and all the financial burden is left on the man alone. There's bound to be problems upon problems upon problems where you have just one financial contributor to the home. And also considering the fact that the elderly, their aged parents, need to be looked after. Where will they get the money to look after them? So the wife needs to also work in order to bring in the funds. So it's not wickedness at all. It's not inhumane. It doesn't mean that when a couple decide to send the loved ones into a care home that they're abandoning them. No, there's no such thing. There's no case of abandonment. No, nothing like that. Now, there's another a myth that working in those staff working in a care home environment might maltreat the residents there. It doesn't, well, I wouldn't say that it doesn't happen. If there's any incident and it is traced down to any form of maltreatment by a staff, the police are on the case. And depending if that staff is found guilty, they go into jail. Like I said here, there are so many rules and regulations, governing the care of the elderly or people classified as vulnerable. And nobody would want to have their name being put down as a criminal. Do you understand? Because it affects your record. Before you are employed as in a care home facility or looking after anybody classified as vulnerable, not just the elderly, there's something that they know as a check. They will send your name to the police to check if you have had any record of maltreating any person in that position. Because anybody found to be foul of that law, maltreating an elderly, the person's name goes down on the system here, meaning that you can't work with anybody classified as vulnerable anymore. And nobody in the right senses would like their names to be soiled. You understand? So staff in care environments are like every other person. They will have a heart of compassion and they do what they need to do to ensure the comfort and the well-being of those that are put in their care. And there's also that myth that care environments are unhygienic. No, no, no. Because from time to time, we have spot checks by staff in the social care sector. What I mean by spot checks is that they just drop into your home, your work environment. They don't need to tell you to come and look and see, one, how the staff are working, whether we are complying to the set down rules and regulations by government, whether the home environment is up to, is hygienic, all those things. They get into the kitchen area, they monitor the staff. So we cannot afford to keep unhygienic homes. It's impossible. So that's it, really, on the area of cracking the myth code. I mean, the myths, dispelling all the myths that people have about care homes. That's it.
Thank you. Those insights were really very helpful. And I liked how you've spelled it out very clearly, especially for countries where the infrastructure is well laid out, that they have governing rules, policies, and things like that. So people need to understand that it's the same as a regular job, but there are rules, there are procedures. It's helpful to see how you've clarified that for our listeners. Could you help us understand why you think it's essential to challenge the myths that surround the elderly care, as this is often a belief the elderly themselves hold about themselves? I know you've talked about the society, but there are other myths as well that even the elderly have believed in about when they get to that time in their lives. This is not a good deal. This is not a good time. How do you help our listeners challenge those myths themselves? Even the elderly have now come to believe that this is true.
That's absolutely true. Like I said, there's a societal myth, and then there's a myth held by the elderly themselves. One of the myths is that aging is equal to decline. To that myth, I would say a yes and also no. Because naturally, as we progress in life, right, our body functions begin to slow down. The way I am now currently is not the way I was about 30 years ago and so on. It's a natural progression in life. Regardless of the amount of money we have to take care of ourselves, our body functions begin to slow down. So yes, to an extent, there's a decline in health. The elderly naturally will not be able to do some of the things that they would have done. They don't have that level of energy anymore. And yes, there's a decline in health due to the fact that there are some medical conditions associated with aging. There are some medical conditions associated with aging. But it's not a one-size-fits-all. I've also noticed, working with the elderly, that many who are campus mentors they are loaded with loads of wisdom. They have a lot of wisdom. They are a treasure trove of wisdom because of the experiences gained over the years. And more so, the time that many of them were living in, were born and brought up, some of them immediately after the First World War, some of them the Second World War, they'll tell you stories of how they survived. And we know that any war situation is not desirable at all, but they were able to come out of, not just the physical aspect of the damage of the war, but the psychological aspect, and then forge on in life, get married, raise a family, and so on. So many of them, in fact, virtually all, are a treasure trove of wisdom. So in terms of that, I wouldn't say that aging is equal to decline 100%, even though there's a decline in physical activity, in health and so on. No, they are not. So we can't afford to write them off because, like I had said earlier when we started, many of us are praying to live long. And none of us would like to be treated as if, we are no longer relevant. And if somebody sees you walking, walking very slowly on the street, possibly with a walking aid, and then they treat you as if you're rubbish. And no, not one of us would like to have that treatment from anybody. So I wouldn't say that that myth is 100% correct, that they have declined. No, only their bodies, but many of them are very sound mentally. And then there's a second myth that elderly abuse is most likely to happen in nursing homes, in care homes, which is not correct. I spent a bit of time talking about the structure here. Because before one sets up a care home in any part of the world, it's something that is done in conjunction with the government, naturally, because there are tons of so many laws that guide the care of those that are classified as vulnerable, of which the elderly belong to. And also, they'll also work closely with the police. You understand? So the elderly in societies like this that have been well established and things have been put in place, nobody who has the proper senses working in them would want to abuse the elderly because they know that there's not a strong possibility, that they know that they're tampering with the destiny in terms of work, the ability to work, and so on. It may also, depending on the kind of case, it may end up landing them in jail. Nobody in the right senses would want to put themselves in a position where they are put behind bars because there was some form of abuse to the elderly in their care. That's another myth that the elderly hold, about going into a care home, the dread going into a care home in societies that don't have a proper understanding. And it doesn't happen. I'd like to assure listeners, viewers, that no, there's no abuse. And then there's the third myth that elderly people have similar needs. It's not one size fits all. For instance, before a would-be resident is offered a place in a care home, what happens, like where I work, it's either the manager, the deputy manager, or the senior carers would go into the home of that elderly would-be resident to conduct some findings. We call it assessment. And in a situation where the elderly may not be able to speak up for themselves, because unfortunately some lose the ability to talk as they age, and their loved one has to be there during their appointment where the assessment is made. And one of the things that govern, one of the things that they tend to find out, other than the history, how they were, where they were born, the family of birth, what they did in life, the spouses, their children, and so on, is to find out the medical needs as well. To find out the medical needs. Because every need of the resident is not one size fits all. There are some residents who, by virtue of their health challenges, may require more care, more attention than others. So the care is tailor-made to each and every resident that we have. So yes, there may be some peculiar needs, but the needs vary. And that is established during the assessment. And also, there's also the myth that seniors want to be left in peace and quiet. The question is, who doesn't like peace? Who doesn't like quietness? In a care home, the environment is such that everything that is done, the atmosphere, the personalized care, the tailor-made care, ensures that they spend the rest of their days in peace and in quiet. It's not a chaotic environment. For instance, where I work, right, most care homes are not usually situated in, should I say, the center of town where there's a lot of activity and noise. They tend to be situated in places that are quiet in terms of the environment. So yes, there's a lot of peace and there's a lot of quiet with regards to the environmental factor. And also, if there is any known case of the would-be residents not getting on well with a particular member of their family, it is during the assessment that such things are found out. And what happens is that the name of that person who probably would cause stress or who causes stress to the resident is made known, and that person would be debarred from coming into the home to visit that resident. That's it. So they live in peace and they live in quiet. We ensure that we provide them with the best, physically, emotionally, all round. There's also the myth that when a person is old, they can no longer be creative, you don't expect the elderly to be creative. When we talk about creativity, what are we really talking about when we're talking about creativity? Yes, there's a lot of creative potentials in the younger ones, but creativity has to come with ideas, right? It starts with an idea. And then there's a myth that there's a cognitive decline in the elderly. Yes, to an extent, there is. Let's admit it that it's true, but the cognitive decline also has to do with whatever health condition they're living with. For instance, where I work in, it's a care home with dementia. And dementia is something that affects the brain. It affects the ability to remember, They do not forget 100%, but what happens in most cases with dementia, you have Alzheimer, and we have different types of dementia as well, and different types of Alzheimer. It depends on where the disease is affecting, with the part of the brain that is affecting. But there's one general thing with them, is that they tend to relive their childhood days. That's what happens. Yes, there's that cognitive decline, particularly with those living with dementia and Alzheimer. They may not be able, to in fact, some can be so, I don't want to use the word bad, but depending on the stage of the dementia, that sadly, they may not recognize their family members anymore. At times, they may not recognize their family members, but other times, they're able to remember. It's sad, because these are things outside of their control. So to that extent, yes, there's that, the cognitive ability, is affected. And then there's the other myth that elders are technologically challenged. To that, I would say yes and no. Technology
Mm,
is not necessarily something of their generation, but there are some of them who at least have an idea of using smartphones. And come to think of it, what do they really need technology for at their age? Because all of them have had retired from active service. And retiring from active service means they're no longer engaged in the day-to-day living to make a day-to-day working, going to work and looking for a means of livelihood. No, they're retired. So they don't necessarily have to have that kind of technological expertise that their grandchildren have. Many of them
mm.
have smartphones and they know how to use smartphones. And many of them have televisions. They know how to press the buttons to turn the televisions on and so on, because that is what they really need at that age. Every other thing that they'll require is actually done for them. That's it. Those are some of the myths that they themselves hold. And I hope I've been able to at least shed a bit more light on the myths that they have. They hold.
Yes, absolutely. It's been very, very enlightening. And I like the part where you've kind of helped us understand that one size doesn't fit all. So
Yeah.
I know earlier on we talked about the WHO categorization, right? And even in that
Mm,
update, there was also that disclaimer to say, depending on where you are or where you live, being old or elderly doesn't necessarily mean that you're depreciating. You still have old people that
mm,
are vibrant, they're working, they're exercising, they're going to work. So, ultimately, it all depends on how well we're able to take care of ourselves, but it doesn't automatically mean that the elderly are useless. So it's really been very helpful how you've helped us to really dissect and understand that yes, there are certain things that go with aging, but it doesn't necessarily mean that being elderly is an hopeless situation, if you allow me to use that word. So thank you for providing that
mhm.
clarity, and I believe it's really helpful for our listeners. Now, for some of us, especially women, I know you talked about this or you alluded to it earlier, the mindset of caring for the elderly actually falls on our shoulders. Women are generally looked at in certain cultures as the ones who take full responsibility for caring for the elderly at home. However, there are some family commitments that act as a hindrance, and you've already touched on that. I've had some women say they're raising their own families, they're working jobs, taking on an older parent or both parents, it's a lot of a strain on them, their finances, their homes, and frankly, even on their marriages. So for those of our listeners listening in again, it's just me re-echoing that while this is true, the elderly facility schemes available to us is an opportunity for us to leverage, right? And be able to also balance out our family commitments while we engage fully with utilizing this scheme so that we can also ensure that our elderly are well taken care of. So shifting gears a bit, I'm going to talk around setting I see it as, I would see it as an issue because I think the problem runs much deeper in terms of trying to get people to steer away from certain myths that you helped us demystify earlier. But there's still some connection or a belief that caring for the old is not particularly an attractive job. Hence, it's not appealing because there's a lot of responsibilities involved in doing this. What would you say to people that have this perception that if you're caring for an elderly as a full-time job, maybe you're in the wrong career?
Well, when you talk about attractive job, I suppose that when people talk about jobs being attractive, they're talking about huge packages, the CEO of a company, they're rolling in thousands and thousands of pounds per annum and so on. attractive. That's possibly what most people want to allude attractiveness, the word attractive, to when it comes to job. For me, having worked with the elderly for quite a while, I have my own conclusions. And one major conclusion is that if you don't have a heart for the elderly, don't go and work. For those in working in care environment, because it will show you up. It will show you up sooner or later. Working in a care environment is not because of the money, and it's also not because people working there don't have other options. No, they have a lot of options. I've had situations where I've interacted with relatives of residents there and where I work, and and you find out that a few of them who have worked, retired, want to come in and assist the elderly. It has to do with compassion. It has to do with love. It has to do with that understanding that as we live each day, we are growing older. So, for instance, here in the Western world, there is that knowledge, there's that understanding. And many, I'm not saying all, many people appreciate the job that carers do. And still others, I've met a couple of people who work in other sectors, and they said that when they eventually leave, they still want to go and assist the elderly. So it has to do majorly with a heart of compassion, with a heart of love. Why do I say that? Because of, the challenges that are peculiar to that industry, just like you have challenges in every other human endeavor in life, any other industry. If people work there for the money or want to work there for the money is not really commensurate with the inputs. But like I said, it has to do with a heart of love and so on, love, compassion, particularly, the elderly, they don't have the ability, they need assistance, they're not able to do the things that they used to do. And those living with dementia, there are certain times of the day that the dementia really kicks in. And during such time, they could exhibit challenging behavior. Now, when you're faced with a resident in your care who is exhibiting challenging behavior, what do you as a staff do? You ought to be able to calm the resident down. You ought to be able to address the situation, not walk away or run away. No, we are not called to run away. We are called to provide care, because we understand that those living with dementia would from time to time act in ways that are not appropriate, in quotes, to society. You get what I'm saying? In terms of how, the things they say to people and so on. So at such times, because we've been given adequate training, and remember I said that we have trainings year in, year out. It's a yearly thing. It's like a refresher training. We are trained on how to manage challenging behavior, which shows up. You don't force a resident. You talk. One of the key things that we do is the ability to communicate, because words are powerful. You're taught how to communicate with a resident who is showing a challenging behavior, because even in the midst of that challenge, the word you speak, they are still able somehow to connect. So when you're able to address the situation, you talk to them in a very calm manner. You do not impose yourself on them, no matter what they do. And some of them could, be a bit violent. They could even try to throw punches at you, which many people who don't understand may find naturally offensive, and they may want to counteract. No, we are not taught to counteract in that manner. We are taught to talk to them, not in an aggressive or raised tone. You're taught to talk to them peacefully calmly, be where you need to be assertive. You mind the words you speak. There's certain language that you use in such moments. Yes. And then it eventually, they'll come round and they'll calm down. You attend to them. You may give them a cup of tea, a cup of coffee with biscuits and so on, and then check up on them, to see how they're doing. Yes, it is. It's not everyone's calling. It's not a very attractive job, but you have to have a heart of care, a heart of love, a heart of compassion to be able to function in that industry. But if you're just going there just to earn a living, I want to go and work and get money and pay my bills, send money home, for those of us who come from different parts of the world, you may not last. You may not last. Yeah. So that's it, really. Compassion is a key word. Compassion and love.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's helpful to note, at least from what I hear you say, it's not just about duty. It's about us weaving compassion into the fabric of our lives as we do the work.
Yeah.
So for those of us that actually do the work of taking care of the elderly, it comes with a sense of compassion. And I also hear you say, or maybe my interpretation would be doing it with that heart of I'm doing this more than for the work, but more in terms of my commitment to also care for them. And it requires a level of understanding and patience as well. And I think it's helpful that you spell that out because for some of us listening in on today's podcast, we may not necessarily have the privilege to take them to a facility where they're cared for. We may be actually the ones taking care of them at home. So maybe it would be helpful for us to also explore medical care or nursing care so that they could come over to visit them and really take care of the medical aspect of their aging. But I know it could be a bit cumbersome when they start to go off track and behave in ways that we don't necessarily align with. So just having you say that being in the facility scheme, you have workers that are trained to understand the psychology and the behavioral nuances. It's really very helpful and comforting so that people that do make the decision to enroll in such services know that their aged parents or elderly ones are really being taken care of. So thank you so much. That's really, really enlightening. Let me move on quickly to our next question. And this is something that I think there are two heavy topics that desire our attention. And I would like for you to address that a bit. And it's more around tackling the impact of solitude and abandonment of the elderly in nursing homes. I know you talked a bit about it, but could you just help us uncover this a bit more? Solitude, they're alone, they're being abandoned. How should we be looking at this for a proper understanding of our mindset, changing the mindset around this, or maybe just doing better so we know better?
Solitude in terms of having a loved one in a care home, I suppose. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, that's exactly my.
There's no solitude. One, a person who has taken the loved ones, for instance, a parent, into a care home, does that based on the fact that one, they don't have the time, even though they would have wished to. Secondly, it may be as a result of the fact that probably they may at some point been managing with the elderly, coping with, assisting them. But it may have gotten to a point where, their health had deteriorated to a point that they knew that they couldn't cope anymore. So they decided to send the loved ones into a care home, to be looked after. In a care home, I wouldn't say there's anything like solitude. But having said that, you also have cases where the resident prefers their space, right? because you have communal areas. We have like lounges. We have what, for instance, in my workplace where I work, there's what we call the reminiscence room. The reminiscence room is set up with equipment and tools that they were familiar with when they were growing up. We have sewing machines. You have, this hand, the sewing
Okay,
machine
is it
that you
knitting?
turn with your hand. I forgot. Yeah, you
Okay.
have those ones in the reminiscence room. And then you have radiograms in the reminiscence room. You have scales, some people still use those kind of scales in some parts of the world where you put, when you want to measure something, there's the bowl on one side and then there's the weight. You put the weight, to try, all those things are put there. So, and also, we also, for instance, talking from experience working where I work, we also draw up activities. It's a thing in all care homes. For instance, I believe it's tenable to all care homes here across the UK. They try to engage them. So the issue of solitude is completely addressed, trying to engage them with games. Some of the games are like quizzes, because many of them, those who read papers, and many of them still have subscription to their daily papers, which are supplied to them. Most of those papers have crossword puzzles at a certain page, on the certain page of the paper. So when they've read through all the content, you see them sitting down to do the crossword puzzles. We have a dedicated activity coordinator who draws up a weekly schedule of activities to engage them. Yes, we know that it's not one size fits all. He has the group activity sessions. It's from Monday to Sunday. And he also has the one-to-one session where he sits down with a resident based on their life, and he now has an activity with them. I also come in as a chaplain, and my major activity is to chat with them, keep them company for those who can chat, or for those who are not really able to really express themselves, knowing that there's someone sitting with you just is enough to reassure them that they are not alone, because they've studied the psychology of loneliness, and, they know what to do. They've come up with so many programs. Apart from the indoor activities, we have the quizzes, we have painting, we have flower arrangement, we have baking. We also take residents who love to go for walks in the garden. We take them for walks. Those who are able to go onto the high road, we take them for walks on the high road. It has to be according to the ability of the resident. We also have a film show session which comes up once in a week, and we've got this massive screen. And most of the films that they are played and that they are shown are films that they all grew up with. Films of the 50s, films of the 60s, And we also have what we call a music therapy session, because it's been established that even those living with dementia, one thing that resonates with the elderly is music. Music of the 50s, of the 40s, of the 60s. And we have
like
this
that.
music, it's a sing-along. It's a sing-along session. And, the music is printed. Many of them know the wordings at the top of their head. So when the music therapist comes, plays the keyboard, the piano, and begins to sing, they all join in. So at the end of the day, you really can't say that they are lonely. And, this is apart from the regular visits that they have from the loved ones, depending on where the loved ones are. Some of them live close by, some of them live in other parts of the UK, and some even live in other parts of the world. But those that live in other parts of the world, they still communicate with the loved ones via telephones. And we also have this structure. We have this weekly printout. It's like a social magazine just for a resident. It was developed during the COVID. And what happens is that the loved ones send photographs and a little bit of write-up of what they did for those who went on holiday or whatever they did at home and so on. And then they will send it to us. We compile like a magazine and then share it amongst all the residents. So with all the activities we have, they can be said to be lonely. We also have occasions where we take them out to cafes, or they are taken out to sightseeing. But all those places that for those the times where they are taken out, we have to ensure that it is safe enough for them to be taken out to such places. We'd also had occasions where they've engaged in quizzes with other homes as well. One home going for a quiz in another home and so on. So in terms of loneliness, I wouldn't, honestly, it just doesn't exist per se. It just doesn't exist because there are so many activities to engage our residents in order to ensure that they are not lonely. They don't develop feel lonely or so on. Yeah, so that is well taken care of.
Well, that's really helpful. I like the music piece, which I think it's really good. So if we move on to the other side of it, because this is an ideal situation where you do have family members checking in, but there are certain situations where family members don't. And this is where the issue of abandonment pops up. The question, how should we address it?
Well, there are also cases where you have residents who don't have family members, either because they were either not married or they're married but chose not to have children. But we occupy them as much as we can, and many of them come into their facility with pictures of their loved ones, of the life when they were working or things like that. Pictures of their younger days, what they used to do and things like that. So we engage them, take the photographs, ask questions, and it's always lovely to see their faces light up when they go down memory lane. You understand? To make them know that, yes, we appreciate what you did in your heydays. We acknowledge the fact that you played a vital role in the contribution of the society and things like that, So that case of abandonment, as it were, is taken care of. We engage them. Do you understand? We don't allow them to feel abandoned, where such things are noticed. We don't allow them to feel abandoned. We engage them, make sure that we occupy them, and that takes their mind away. Yes, once in a while, there may be that, it may seep in, but we try as much as possible to engage them. And in most cases, to be honest, we don't really have cases of abandonment because we are expected to try and fill the gap. This is in a care home situation that I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I know there are a lot of people listening in, and it may not be as well laid out with infrastructure that your care home has. But in any case, I think it's helpful for us to call this out, say that while we do have the facility or the institutions or the schemes to help support or care for elderly, we're responsible for them. So placing our loved ones, whether it's in the care home or nursing home, or whatever terminologies we use in our respective countries, does not automatically mean they don't need me to visit them. So we shouldn't abandon them there. Family members, I believe, have the responsibility of taking time to see or visit their loved ones as well. And I believe this could help them. You've mentioned a lot of things earlier on in terms of cognitive decline. And I think just seeing the loved ones could also improve their mental state, could help them in terms of their physical well-being as well. So I think it's helpful to call that out so our listeners kind of understand that. And thank you so much.
Yeah,
I think the insights you are very, very helpful.
May I also add to that, please? You see, because we have contact addresses of the loved ones, and most of the time, the loved ones, most of them have the LPA, the power of attorney. So we are bound, duty bound, to give them updates on any changes, any developments, any concerns. So even if they feel they're abandoned, what we do, we reach out to the loved one and say, hey, this is what your mom or your dad is saying, and things like that. You know, this is what your mom, and also it, like I had mentioned earlier on, it depends on the part of the world they are in.
True.
There's a resident who had a child in, you know, Australia is so far. It's virtually a day's journey. But he also had siblings here who would come in every week to visit. But the one who wasn't able to come in regularly would come in once in a year to visit the mom physically, but would also phone the mom weekly. So those kind of people, those kind of cases where a loved one is put into the care home, and then the surviving relative or the person that brought them there turns the back and walks away from them. It's rare. I'm not saying it has never happened. It's rare. It's rare. But we are duty bound to fill the loved one in with on any development, change in health, if there are any concerns, anything at all. We pick up the phone them, or we send them emails because we've got all the contact details of the loved ones to keep them abreast. Because, you know, we are, one other thing about care homes that they are very big in record keeping. Extremely big in record keeping. Records have to be kept with everything that is done. I, as a chaplain, when I go visit residents, I have to record what I did. The only thing is that as a chaplain, because we are expected, it's understood that we may have confidential interactions. We are not expected to write out the details. But what I tend to say is, I chatted, I did this, or if I notice any concern, I may tell the senior on the floor, depending on the nature of the concern, or I may tell the manager, depending on the nature of the concern. So every care home is exceedingly big on documentation. Why? Reason being that if there is in future, at any point in time, should there arise any legal contention with any of the residents, what we do is we pull up the records. This person did this to the, when it was time, the other person attended, this is what they did, this is what they did, this is what was observed. Everything has to be documented. That's it. So the issue of a loved one turning their back, as it were, it's a bit rare. It's not a very common phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So just moving on, what should our listeners take into consideration when they're looking out for an institution where they would like to place their aged parents or elderly ones or loved ones? What should they be looking out for before making those decisions?
They have to first and foremost understand the health needs of their loved ones.
Okay.
Yes, like I said, as we age, the body functions slow down, and you know they begin to develop health challenges that are peculiar to aging.
Mm-hmm.
There are ordinary care homes, and there are care homes with dementia. There are nursing homes as well. In a care home, let me at least at this point try and distinguish the difference, you know, between a care home and a nursing home. In a care home, nurses come to attend to residents. They come, community nurses. They come as scheduled, come attend to residents, give them whatever treatment they're required to give, and then they go. But in a nursing home, the major difference is that the nursing home has a qualified nurse on its staff list, whereas a care home doesn't. Now, the relative has to know the level of care, has to have an understanding of the level of care that the loved one requires. Is it an ordinary care home? Is it a care home with dementia? meaning that the loved one has been certified, medically, as one who is living with dementia? Or is it a nursing home? Because in cases where you have residents in a care home or a care home with dementia, there are certain times, certain instances where their health deteriorates to a point where it's advised that they now have to go into a nursing home. But before that decision is arrived at, the medical personnel have to come in. We work hand in hand with social services, with the medical profession and medical profession as well, because the assessment has to be done by qualified people in the system. They said no. And in addition to the manager, the deputy manager, and the senior carers, the person's medical needs are beyond what can be handled in a care home or a care home with dementia. The person now needs to go into a nursing home. So that's why I'm taking time to analyze this. So to say that the loved one has to understand the level of care that the loved one require. Then, before you know what care home to probably send your loved one to, you now go to the site, because there are ratings. We are required to ask the relatives to give a rating to the home on a yearly basis. There are ratings. There are certain questions that are asked to all the relatives, which they respond to. And this is posted on the site. Everything has to be open for all to see. So you now go to the home, the kind of home where you'd like your loved ones to go into, and look at the rating. The rating will help you determine whether to send your loved one there. And when you now determine the home, another thing I'd like to suggest that you do is now book to take a physical look at the home. Go into the home, because we are open to viewing. Go and view the home. You go book an appointment, say you'd like to come and look at the home. And by law, we are open to anybody who would like to come and look at the home. You're shown around the home, the kind of services that are offered and so on. That will help you. All these things will help you determine what kind or which home you'd love your loved one to go. And also, there's a matter of cost. There's a matter of cost, because from my experience, sending your loved one into a care home could be very expensive, depending on I'm not saying this to put anybody up, depending on your ability. But having said that, there are also cases where the government assists the resident, the pay towards the upkeep of a resident in a care home, in this part of the world, that is. So all those factors should be things that help you determine which care home to send your loved one into when the time comes.
Thank you. It's really very enlightening that you've shared so much details. And I believe our listeners are paying attention. Being physically in the home also is helpful. So at least you can see for yourself. So that's really very helpful. Thank you for sharing those insights. So I'm going to move on to really focus on a question that I think comes very dear to you and as a clergy, and is, how do you approach end of life conversations with compassion?
It's a very touchy area. It's a very touchy, and it could be emotional. But one of the things, what has helped in where I work, the work environment, is that when the assessment is done, everything that needs to be known about the resident is documented up to the end of life. What they want done is documented. Some may say, okay, when that time comes, I just want classical music. Some may say, okay, when that time comes, I want you to light a candle and things like that. So we are duty bound to follow what they had requested or what they want done. But as a clergy, or I mean, as someone who works in that capacity in a home as a chaplain, what I do, it depends on the stage of the end of life. And I've also learned that apart from sudden death scenarios, which does happen occasionally, there are stages to die. I never knew. There are stages to die. It comes to when a resident begins to decline food. They don't no longer interested in food. That may be, an indication that they are getting into that end of life stage. Some of them may decline food for a while and afterwards they begin eating again. But it tends to start with going off feeding, going off food. They refuse eating. And then there comes a time when that happens for a while. There comes a time, naturally, they'll be weak. They're not able to move around anymore. So they're constantly in bed, but they're still conscious, they're still alert. So what happens at whatever stage of end of life they are in, we've got a team that we also work closely with. They're called the palliative care team. They are nurses who only specialize with end of life. They'll come and look at the person and assess if that person is truly at that point. And if that assessment is made, they leave a kit. And the kit has to do with swabs because at that point they completely refuse eating. Some may even at least attempt fluids, water or anything, just be taking very slight sips. But when that stage passes, for those who might still be taking water, meaning that their eyes are still open, they are conscious, but they are weak. They can no longer move about. They are in the bed. The swab, the dab, the swab, moisten the lips and so on. What I tend to do as a chaplain, depending on their belief system, because I'm a chaplain to all, those who are Christians, those who are Muslims, and so on. Some, I attend to each and every one of them. At that stage, I go and sit down, knock on the door of their room because we still treat them with all dignity, which is a watchword of the industry I work in. You have to treat everyone with dignity, regardless of what stage of life they are at. You treat them with dignity. You knock on the door, go in, introduce yourself, tell them why you're there. I will do that and I'll sit by them for those who are still alert. And even when they now go into a coma, I still do the same. I sit down with them. And depending on the belief system, mostly I must say a silent prayer, but many of them at that stage, because when they are in a coma, they are not able to relate anymore, but they are still very much aware of what is happening in their surrounding. Because one of the things that was told when I was training is that when somebody is in a coma, there's that tendency to believe that, to believe that they are no longer connected. The only thing is that they cannot respond to what they've heard. They hear everything that is going on. I was given this story, which even though was like, what should I say, queer or funny story, but it nailed home the point. There's a group of friends who went to visit another friend of theirs who was in a coma. They sat down by the bedside and they were chatting away, saying also, I don't know what it was they were saying, whether they were talking about the good times they had, or whether they were even talking, saying negative things about their friend. I don't know. But the irony of it is that the friend came out of the coma and now recounted everything they said. So we don't say anything negative when you go to visit somebody and the person is in a coma. You don't say it. Even if that person was a very nasty person, you still give them the dignity and the respect that you should give them. You don't say anything negative. So I go back there, sit by them. If they're in a coma, I say a silent prayer, just sit by them for a while. And as a chaplain, we're expected to spend a lot of time with those that are at the end of life. And after a
Wow.
while, I leave, tell them that I'm going, and that's it. But when it eventually happens that they die, how we break the news to the loved ones also matters. And when the loved ones come, because as a chaplain in where I work, we have been tasked with the responsibility of training every staff as to how to um, assist or continue to serve. There is more of the attitude of how we serve those that are at the end of life. So everybody from the manager down to the list staff, whatever I wrote, everyone has to. It's a mandatory training program, and it's a face-to-face program, training program, not an online program. You know, when the loved ones come in after the news has been broken, if the, we are expected not to run away, to do a runner. They come and we see them, we offer our condolences, and you give them the space. And they come when I'm around. I tend to hug people a lot, you know, particularly the women, hug them, comfort them, say a word of prayer for them, and then leave them to go and, just sit by the bed before the corpse is taken away. Yeah, so it's very touching. But since we are trained on how adequately to handle that aspect of life, it's dignity all the way to the end until they breathe their last. And that's what we offer. It has to be done. That's it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this delicate and yet essential part of their journey with us. And I know it's indeed a solemn time and interestingly, an imminent end for all of us. And often a tough time for families. But I think one thing to really call out is just the fact that while our elders are still here, we need to be there for them. Being there for them, it's really important so that when they do depart, they depart peacefully. And at least we're doing the best we can in line with what truly mattered to them. We know that we were there for them when it truly mattered. And those shared memories are what's going to live on, in our hearts and in our lives. So it's so helpful for you to really share those very intimate and details with us. I think it does help a lot. So thank you so much, Ms. Susan. I'm moving on to the question of making plans for our loved ones when they pass. And I know in some parts of certain cultures, this is frowned at. How would you help our listeners understand this a bit more better in terms of why it's important to even make plans ahead of the funeral or passing of our loved ones? I know it's such a sensitive subject, but we'd just like to hear from you in terms of tips or advice or what have you, so that we could do it better or just have that awareness and understanding.
Thanks so much, Fumike. Yes, it is a sensitive topic, as you've said, in certain parts of the world. But from my experience in this industry thus far, I would like to say straight away that it's the best thing to do, because everything is streamlined. And when everything is streamlined, the possibility of confusion, the possibility of the surviving members fighting with each other with regards to, oh, this should be done, the other one comes with an opposing view, is completely eliminated. Now, what I have observed is virtually all the residents have in place a will. In that will, which they have a power of given over to someone that they are chosen as to hold the power of attorney over. The will, some of the things that are contained in the will is for those who had assets, who had some money and things like that. There is spelled out in the will. It's clearly, shown in the will how the funds should be distributed. Secondly, they also in the will had, most of them, virtually all, most, if not virtually all of them, had also made plans as to how they want the funeral to be conducted. So everything is clearly spelled out. This, as I said, eliminates the kind of feud that tends to arise in some parts of the world, in some cultures, when a loved one passes on. You find out that when it happens, the family may be torn apart because the surviving relatives, probably the children, come up with differing opinions, as to what should be done. But where it is clearly spelled out, that is eliminated. And another fear why many people in certain parts of the world do not consider having a will in place is that when you suggest it, they said, oh, are you thinking that I would die, or do you expect me to die soon? Do you want me to die soon? It has nothing. A will is just a paper, legal document as to what you want done, right? If that will doesn't have the power to control your life. It's a paper. The only thing is that it has received a seal of approval and things like that, until when the person passes on, it now comes into effect. Now, when a person writes a will, there have been cases where the person has gone back to amend the will while they're still alive. Some of the people, would have written the will 25 years before the passed on, 30 years before the passed on. And in the course of time, if they feel that adjustments should be made to the will, they still have the rights and the ability to do that. And besides, why we encourage people to do that is one of my roles as a chaplain, staff, is that we never know how we will age, right? What do I mean? People who are unfortunately currently living with dementia never really anticipated that they would have dementia, even though at times they say it tends to run in the family. Even when it does, one doesn't know the degree to which they'll be affected by dementia. So we always, we tend to suggest and advise our staff that, look, now that you're still able, your compass mentors, you have your lives, you know the things that you like, you know this and that about your life, write it down. Write it down. Because as we age, like I said just a moment ago, some people may have the ability to be able to think out things for themselves. So when that is clearly spelled out through the process of a will, documented, and so on, receives, because it has to be passed, it has to be recorded, and all those processes go through, it now becomes a legal document, which has to be followed by the relatives when the person passes on, whether or not the relatives like it or not. It's a document that has been empowered to be followed by the surviving relatives. They don't have any choice, no option. So while it is necessary that our loved ones have this in place, it's also necessary that we who are alive and who have prayed for long life should also begin to consider making plans. Making a plan towards your death doesn't mean that you're going to die immediately. No, we know it's something that will surely come. We all make plans about parties, birthdays, a child celebration. We celebrate so many events. Making a will in the very simplistic form means what you want done after you've passed. And because it's an industry that believes in giving people dignity to the very last. And because we know that obeying that will, which is now a legal document, is part of showing dignity to the person who has departed. The surviving members of the family or whoever has the LPA has no other option than to follow that which have been legally documented. So we encourage staff, that's one of my responsibilities, begin to think about it, putting things in place, because we will get there one day, getting old one day and so on, and we don't know how we age. That's it. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does, absolutely. And thank you for providing such perspective. And you're right, in certain of our cultures, I know it's been frowned at rather when conversations around planning for funeral while the person is still alive is being pushed, you know, so it's a sensitive conversation. But I think it's helpful also to kind of compare it with the insurance that we're doing these days, right? Because in a sense, it's sort of like a guarantee just in case. I know some of our listeners are on life insurance. It doesn't mean that we're going to die, but just in case, so
Precisely.
that we are responsible and we're able to care for our family and we have something that they can lean on. And for some people that maybe have not done it and they're working for companies, companies make it mandatory. I mean, most companies make it mandatory to insure their employees. So at least from that angle, that's something that is a policy that is in place. So if listeners are listening in, if they could kind of shift their heart in that line, probably make it easier to absorb the information that planning for funerals of your parents or elders or having something in place would make it a bit much easier and helpful for the family to do things in line with their wishes and their desires. And it makes it a bit much more straightforward. And I don't know if it's helpful to just clarify because I know in certain parts of the world as well, certain people want to be buried in certain ways. Some people want to be cremated. Some people want a regular coffin or what have you. And is this part of the will that you're speaking about, or this is a completely different process?
No, it's a part of the will because the person will, in the will, lay out how the actual funeral should be conducted. Like you've rightly pointed out, those who are Christians, for instance, who have a belief system, will say, okay, I want the funeral to be handled by those of my belief system, the head of my belief system. You understand? Others may say, who don't have a belief system, they say, okay, they I don't know how, I've actually forgotten the word, where you call people to come and, they're not preachers, but they come and conduct the funeral service. Is like, there's some kind of I think they're known as chaplains, I've forgotten the name, but they come and it has nothing to do with the scriptures or any faith at all. Based on the person's background, they would have drawn up a plan. So many of them have had drawn up the funeral plan, listed for those that, for instance, Christians, listed the hymns, the Bible reading, every single thing. You know, it's not a rarity; it's common. So those who don't have a belief system would also have drawn up a program, or would have given an indication of what they want the program to look like. You know, we want this kind of, I want to be buried by this kind of person. These are the kind of this is the kind of classical music I want played and things like that. So everything is followed to the letter. Everything and it makes it easier for those who have to conduct the funeral. There's no ambiguity. There's no confusion whatsoever. And in the process as well, they would have said, okay, because burials here in cemeteries and so on, you pay for the ground and it's pretty expensive. So those who are not willing or may not have money may say, okay, you know what? I want a cremation. I prefer cremation. I want to be cremated. And possibly they will say, I attended one recently, fairly recently, where the person was cremated and then the ashes were sprinkled in something that looked like a garden, in a little space, you understand? Some may say, okay, after the cremation, gather the ashes, and there's always an urn where they put the ashes into, and bury it, or some may even take the ashes home. They said, okay, give it to my surviving daughter. All those things are actually spelled out so that when that eventually happens and the funeral is conducted, you find out that the relative merely follows what had the indications that have been laid down by the loved ones before the past. So yes, it's very necessary. It's very necessary to do that.
Well, thank you for shedding so much light. To be honest, I've learned a lot just from the conversation and the way things are structured and just the planning and organization that goes into caring for the elderly, even up to the point of passing, and more importantly, even preparing for their funeral. So it's just part of how we show our love, how we show that we care for them, and how we just, treasure those memories and ensure that we did our possible best. So I think it's helpful that you brought this up and you provided such clarity. And for those of our listeners listening in that have never thought about this before, I think knowledge is power. They can go back and think through it again and make a decision for themselves that part of caring for our elderly is also planning for their passing. And that involves making sure that there's a will in place, a power of attorney, whatever, in case they come to a point where they are unable to make those decisions for themselves. It's part of the care and the love that we show for them to make sure that at least we've done our possible best while they're alive. And I believe it also sends a tone and a legacy for the future because, like you've said earlier, we're all growing. We someday will become the elderly, and it's those principles and structures we put in place that our children would also emulate and follow through on. So thank you. This has been really, really enriching. And I believe our listeners as well would more than agree that it's been enlightening. I encourage you to go and do the research for yourselves, find out what works for you, but at least now we know that that's also helpful in terms of how we care for elders, and it's helpful that we make those steps and take those decisions on time before it's too late. I'm just going to ask this question before we close off, and it comes with the mindset that should caring for elders be limited to kin and bloodline? I mean, if seniors or elders are not related to us and we see that they have a need, are we really obligated to help them?
Well, it depends on the kind of care. It's not, I'd like to start with, it depends on the kind of care. The day-to-day physical needs of the elderly in our society naturally is handled by the family of that elderly person, right? In that sense, is what the family does. Except, of course, they employ somebody to come, a professional, to come and look after the loved ones at home. For instance, here we have also schemes where carers go into homes of residents, sent there by care companies who offer such kind of services. They go into the home environment of the residents and they offer care there. But it also has to do with the level of need. Now, in terms of offering care to the elderly, in the home environment, I think it's something that is reserved strictly for the family. But if we see them, for the elderly who are still able, who still have the mobility to an extent, even though they may use walking aids like Zimmer frames, or they may use a stick or anything, or even those who use motorized bikes. It depends where we find them. If we find them, for instance, those who have motorized bikes, they go for their shopping and so on. If we find them in the shops, there's something, we find them in the aisle, we can, oh, please help me with this, help me pick this thing off the shelf. Because for those who use motorized bikes, they're permanently seated on the bike. The only time they tend to leave the bike is when they're changing from the bike either to the chair or even to the bed. So you go into a shopping environment, for instance, you see them shopping, and you can assist them. How can I help you? What do you want? Or, things that are stacked on shelves in the aisle. Now you go, because like in a society that is structured like such as I live in currently, they take cognizance of the fact that the elderly are amongst us, and they make provisions, they provide for them in different spheres of society. For instance, in public transportation sectors, you go on the train, there are seats that are designated for the elderly and the pregnant women. If you happen to sit on those seats, the natural thing to do when you see such a person walk into the bus or onto the train, for those who still are able to move around, you get up. You don't argue. You see them coming, they are given preference. So in that sense, yes, we can assist. We can assist to the extent of where we find them. But when it comes to the home environment, giving them personal care, this is something I believe that should be determined by the family because of the intricacies of the personal care involved. You understand? It's
Yeah.
something that the family needs to sit down and decide. This is what we want done. If the elderly wants to be looked after in the home environment, they have to go to, I would strongly suggest that they go to a care providing agency where they have staff that are trained to go into people's homes and know what to do, and some of them may have some of the elderly, the children may be wealthy, they may have some kind of aid, like aids to lift up their loved ones and things like that, which we have in care homes. You need professional training to know how to handle those things. And in some cases, you have cases where, based on the health condition of the person, and secondly, might be the weight of the person, you need what we call double up. Double up meaning that you need at any time 2 carers to attend to that person so that no accident will happen. Because in this society, anytime an accident happens, the police are there. Even, for instance, in the care home, this example that I may give may look like a deviation. I just want to bring it in to show that the police are constantly there watching. We're not necessarily watching, we are compelled by nature of the kind of job that we do. We just have to follow the laid down rules and regulations. It's a care home, yes. And we know that when residents come in there, the only other alternative is that they may be transferred to a nursing home where they usually die, or they die in the care home. So when we have, for instance, a case of sudden death, what do I mean by sudden death? The person goes to bed and doesn't wake up the following day. The police have to come in. The police have to come in, even when their loved one have been involved, They have to come in, and there has to be a post-mortem to rule out that there was no foul play in that kind of a case, I'm just bringing this example to say that things have to be done according to law. You just can't cut corners, because where an incident happens, the police are there, and investigations have to be carried out, and the investigations have to be done according to law. That's it. So yes, we can help, but the extent of help that we give to the elderly has to do with where we find them. Not a case of you. If it is in a home situation in parts of the world where we don't have social care facilities as fully established as we do have here in this part of the world, you don't volunteer to go and help, except, of course, the elderly has not been associated with some of the things that we would call serious diseases. They are still able to move around. They are still compass mentors. They are still alert, and so on. All they need is people to come, help them warm the food and little things like that, you understand? In that case, you may not necessarily need a professional person to do it. It depends on the degree of care that is required. That's what I would say in this, in this situation. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I think it's good in terms of the balancing act here, right? The sensitivity of the elderly one's situation and just being mindful so we don't get into trouble. Well, hopefully we're trying to help, especially when we're not related to the individual. But such things as getting up in the bus, helping in a grocery shop to help them locate items. I mean, those are just very simple, basic things that we can do. And I know for some of our listeners listening in, not everyone is coming from that society where things may necessarily be structured and could be just open-ended. But communal living is something that people do practice from day to day. But I'll just say, as a human being, you know, and we know when it's safe to and when it's not safe to do things, but it would be helpful if just giving a hand here and there, checking in, you know, if you notice something, even calling the police or just to make sure that they're okay, knocking on the door, bringing them tea, helping them in whatever little way we can. I think that shouldn't be out of place. So would encourage our listeners, they may not be related to you, but you can support in any little way that you can. So thank you so much, Miss Susan, once again for joining me on this very interesting topic. I believe this has really made a difference, especially for myself, in, you know, getting more educated. And I know that for listeners, it's created a platform for more awareness in terms of our call to action in the care of the elderly. Thank you so much, Miss Susan, once again for joining me today.
Thanks so very much, Funke. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to share my experience and knowledge in that area.
Thank you. So dear listeners, on this note, we'll call it a wrap. I believe we've learned a lot today on how to approach elderly care. Thank you so much for staying tuned in and joining us. Remember, our elders are living libraries full of stories, full of resilience and love that we can tap into for generations to come. And I think more importantly, how our kids and the society see us care for our elderly will help shape how we're cared for when we get older as well. And we become the elderly selves. So let's continue to cherish our elders, dispel myths and act in their favor. And I believe when we honor our elders, the Lord Almighty God will honor us as well. So please keep listening to the Help We Need podcast. Stay tuned in for more episodes on living your best lives. Until next time, stay empowered and remember to empower her.